One of the most important games in Nintendo's history must be Super Mario 64. It was a bit of an experiment after all, and if they had failed, then I bet the Super Mario franchise wouldn't be as famous. And so today I thought it would be a lot of fun to actually look at the evolution of Super Mario 64. How did this game go from a simple concept to reality? How did Nintendo nail their first 3D game while so many others failed? Well, let's look into it all. Because while it all started with miniatures, it quickly developed into a whole lot more. Hey, psst! Be sure to check out Wiley.gg if you're in the market for any games, and use code Wiley to get 5% off. Now let's continue with the video. The year is 1990 and the whole gaming industry was in an interesting spot. Technology was evolving fast, and for the first time ever, the concept, the idea of a 3D game was possible. And so the Super Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto conceived a 3D Mario design while developing the game Star Fox in 1993 for the SNES. The game used the Super FX graphics chip, which added more processing power, and so he considered using the chip to develop a 3D Mario game, with gameplay based on an entire world in miniature, like miniature trains, which is probably the weirdest way to explain your ideas for a game, but hey. Now in the end, Miyamoto reformulated the idea for the Nintendo 64, but not for its greater power, but because its controller had more buttons for gameplay. Now with all the pieces in place, Nintendo started experimenting, and consumers got to see the first bits of a 3D Mario game. At the January 1993 Consumer Electronics Show, Nintendo's booth demonstrated a talking 3D polygon animation of Mario's head, which was also seen in Super Mario 64 when it came out, although it was more refined. Now this is where it all began, with a simple demo where they started to truly mess around with the idea of 3D. And as you can imagine, things went rather quick from this point onward. Production of Super Mario 64 began on September 7, 1994, at Nintendo's Entertainment Analysis and Development Division, and it ended up taking around 2 years in total, which is actually really short and quite surprising. You would have imagined that a 3D game, which they had never made before, would require more time, but apparently this wasn't the case. Heck, according to Miyamoto, the development team consisted of around 15 to 20 people, which also doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, when Majora's Mask was made, it was clear that 1 year was too short, and they could even reuse a lot of assets from Ocarina of Time. But apparently, when it comes to Super Mario games, 2 years while starting with nothing, not even in-depth knowledge of the hardware, is enough. Now development began with the characters and the camera system, and months were spent selecting a view and layout. Now weirdly enough, the original concept involved the fixed path of an isometric game such as Super Mario RPG, but as you can imagine, this didn't stick. It wasn't a Resident Evil game after all, and so they moved to a free-roaming 3D design. But some of the linear paths remained, especially to coerce the player into Bowser's lair. I mean, some form of direction has to be there. Even in a game like Breath of the Wild, we see this. I mean, there's a reason why most people go to the Zoras first. Now another thing that made Super Mario 64 special is that it's one of the first games for which Nintendo produced its illustrations internally instead of outsourcing. And so we ended up with some, wacky art that looks a bit off, especially now that 3D has come so far. And the graphics for the game were made using N-World, which is a Silicon Graphics based toolkit, which overall led to good results, especially for the time. I mean, even now it still looks surprisingly good, especially when you apply HD filters to it. Now one thing the development team focused on the most was Mario's movement. Even before levels were created, they tested and refined Mario's animations on a simple grid, and they even made a room of simple Lego-like blocks where Mario and Luigi could run around, climb slopes, jump around, and more, in order to perfect it all. So while I do criticize the controls of the game at times, it did lead to amazing results, especially compared to almost any other at the time. Now when it came down to the 3D illustrations, they were created by these people, with the game being animated by co-director Yoshiaki Koizuma and Satoru Takiwaza. And Yoichi Kotabe, illustrator and character designer for the Mario series, made a 3D drawing of Mario from various angles and directed the creation of the character models. Now, as you can imagine, all of this was a massive challenge. Just imagine the following. I put you in a room and you had only ever made 2D sprites for games, nothing else. So really, you know very little about creating things in a 3D space. And all of a sudden, you need to make 3D graphics, art, and a whole lot more while you're also working on one of the most famous franchises in history, with a deadline. As you can imagine, this is stupid hard. And in an interview with the Washington Post, Koizumi recalled that his challenge was animating the 3D models without any precedence. However, they were able to use real life to give them an idea of how to tackle this challenge. Miyamoto said it was kind of like sculpting a diorama out of clay, starting with a very general shape and perfecting it all from there. And this approach must have helped. But still, I'm shocked it turned out so well, and I certainly understand the struggle. And they weren't the only ones wrestling with the whole concept. Even players would have to get used to the new world, and Nintendo recognized this. And so, to assist players with depth perception, the team positioned a faux shadow directly beneath each object regardless of the area's lighting. Koizumi even described the feature as an ironclad necessity, which might not be realistic, but it's much easier to play. So at least the players got some help, and even today it is something seen in many 3D games. Yet another way this game was a pioneer. Now, Miyamoto's guiding design philosophy was to include more details than earlier games by using Nintendo 64's power to feature all the emotions of the characters. He likened the game's style to a 3D interactive cartoon, and some details were inspired by the developers' personal lives. For example, the boos are based on assistant director Takashi Tezuka's wife, who, as Miyamoto explained, is very quiet normally, but one day she exploded, maddened by all the time Tezuka spent at work. And this wouldn't be the only time this happened. I mean, the nightmares of developers ended up in Majora's Mask. And the first Zelda was inspired by the childhood memories of Miyamoto in Japan. So clearly, art is often based on life. Now, when it comes down to testing, Super Mario 64 was first run on an SGI Onyx emulator, which only emulated the console's application programming interface and not its hardware. And the first test scenario for controls and physics involved Mario interacting with a golden rabbit named Mips, who was named after the Nintendo 64's Mips architecture processor. And as we all know, the rabbit was included in the final game. And that wasn't the only weird thing seen in this title, because it also featured more puzzles than earlier Mario games. I mean, they were already experimenting with it in Super Mario World, but for this one they went even further. And the reason why is because it was developed simultaneously with The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And as Ocarina of Time was released more than 2 years later, some puzzles were taken from Super Mario 64. So funny enough, these two games had an effect on each other and both became legendary. However, not everything made it in. For example, the multiplayer mode didn't make it into Super Mario 64, and to this day, people are still sad about this. Now let's move on to the last element, sound. The music was composed by Koji Kondo, while Yoji Inagaki was responsible for the sound design. And of course, Charles Martinet became the voice of Mario, and Leslie Swan became the voice of Princess Peach. All of this led to classic songs as well as sound effects that became famous worldwide, with basically every gamer around the world knowing about it. And when the game finally released, it was a massive hit. Against all odds, the first 3D Super Mario title was a masterpiece, while rivals like Sonic failed miserably, and many others in the gaming industry were even inspired by it. For example, Dan Houser, a prominent figure in the development of the Grand Theft Auto series, said, "Anyone who makes 3D games who says they have not borrowed something from Mario or Zelda is lying." But, as you can imagine, I wasn't able to cover everything in this video. But I did link some interesting stuff below in the comment section, like little fun facts. However, I could also make a whole video on it, so let me know what to do below. And in the meantime, check out some of my other videos. Thank you all so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video. Subscribe, like, bell button, all that good stuff. And yeah, let me know what I should do. Should I make a little fun facts about the development thing? Because I found some interviews and stuff. But I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you all so much for watching. My voice is dying. Please help me. I'm sinking to the Mariana Trenches, to the bottom of the sea.